Astronomy, the study of the observation of the celestial bodies, is considered the oldest of the natural sciences. It was initially closely connected with religious and mythological beliefs. Astronomy thus has the same roots as astrology, which assumes a connection between celestial bodies and human fate. The people of Stone Age probably already observed the starry night sky and the course of the sun and moon. Some historians believe that Neolithic structures, such as the famous Stonehenge in England, served both astronomical and cultic purposes. This is also the case for archaeological findings like the famous Nebra sky disk, about whose creators we know almost nothing. However, this video is not about archaeoastronomy. Instead, it will tell about the Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Chinese and Maya. And also, about the influence of the Islamic astronomy and the development towards the astronomy of the Middle Ages. So, it is primarily about the common childhood and youth of the two dissimilar siblings, astronomy and astrology. We will learn how both developed from a religious cult of the stars. After all, both astronomy and astrology still exist today, even if they no longer have much in common. Nevertheless, every one of us knows his zodiac sign, as we know our name, and we are also interested in the signs of other people. How many times you've been asked, "What's your sign?" Today, if you ask astrologers and astronomers about each other's professions, or even dare to confuse the two, you usually put your foot in your mouth. But for what reason? The answer is, they have literally drifted apart. Just like adult siblings who develop in opposite directions. And this is mainly because of the following fact. Being born between July 21st and August 21st supposedly makes you a Leo. The problem is that today, at this time of year, the sun does not stand in the constellation of Leo, but in Cancer. And what is true for Leo and Cancer is equally the case for all other signs of the zodiac. A Cancer is actually born when the sun stands in Gemini, a Gemini is born when the sun is in Taurus, a Taurus is born when the sun is in Aries, and so on. Regardless which sign you were born, the following constellation of the zodiac is always the one in which the sun is located at your date of birth. This is based on the fact that the zodiac is constantly shifting. Since ancient times, it has shifted by about 1 month or one sign of the zodiac. Therefore, today, Cancer is in the place of Leo, Leo in the place of Taurus, and Taurus is in the place of Gemini. In other words, the constellations of the zodiac no longer coincide with the signs of the zodiac. You may ask yourself, what remains of the influence of the stars on humans? If the constellations have swapped their functions, if Cancer today is causing what Leo did in former times, how should there be particular impacts of the zodiacal signs on human fate? The astrologers say, it does not depend at all on the constellation, but only on the zodiacal sign, and this is supposed to be independent of the real constellation in the sky, but it rather corresponds to the celestial sector. This leads the influence of the stars on the human fate completely to absurdity, because it remains an effect without recognizable cause. The impact does not come from the sky or the stars anymore, because along with the zodiacal signs, the whole sky moves in the course of the centuries. The celestial sectors, on which astrologers base their calculations, are just 12 30-degree pieces of a 360-degree circle on a paper sheet or a computer display. The planets exert their effect on an abstract diagram. Consequently, the stars not really count here anymore. And this drifting apart is going on. The gap between zodiac signs and zodiac constellations is widening more and more, century after century. This is how things look from the scientific point of view. Knowing this, you may understand why astronomy and astrology have diverged. But whoever hears about the shift of the zodiac, of course wants to know why it is shifting. The Earth's axis is to blame. Our planet rotates like a humming top. This very slow gyroscopic movement is called precession. Today, the North Pole is still pointing near the northern star, but it didn't in the past, and it won't be that way in the distant future. 4,000 years ago, it pointed to Alpha Draconis, the brightest star in the constellation Draco, the dragon. 14,000 years ago, the Earth's axis pointed near the bright star Vega in the constellation of Lyra, and Vega will again be northern star in about 12,000 years. So, the Earth's axis draws a complete circle in the sky within about 26,000 years. This incredibly long period is called a great year, or Platonic year. Thus, about every 2,000 years, the point of the beginning of spring, the vernal equinox, moves forward along the ecliptic by one zodiacal sign. The vernal equinox is one of the 2 points where the ecliptic, the plane of the sun's orbit, intersects the celestial equator. Here, on the sun's apparent annual path, the sun leaves the southern hemisphere, crosses the celestial equator, and moves north. At the time of the ancient Greeks, the vernal equinox was located in the constellation of Aries. That is why the vernal equinox is also called the Aries equinox and is traditionally represented with the same symbol as the zodiac sign of Aries. However, about 2,000 years ago the vernal equinox moved into the constellation of Pisces. Since this shift has been known, great importance has been attached to it. With regard to changes that took place even earlier, the whole history of the world was divided according to it into the so-called ages. There was the age of Gemini, from about 6400 BC to 4300 BC, and the age of Taurus, from 4300 to 2100 BC, followed by the age of Aries, 2100 BC to 50 AD, and the age of Pisces, in which we live today, from 50 AD and still to the year 2200, when the age of Aquarius begins. Exactly. The very famous age of Aquarius, that has been heralded since the 60s. And which many people believe, or claim, has long since begun. But how can it be? Well, according to the opinion of many esotericists, astrologers, occultists, and New Age followers, the world has actually reached the age of Aquarius since the second half of the 20th century. This is explained by the assumption that, around the birth of Christ, the vernal equinox moved from the constellation of Aries to the constellation of Pisces, and from there about 2,000 years later into Aquarius. The reason is that astrologers use a different reference system than astronomers do. Ancient astrologers divided the zodiac into 12 equal sections. There is an innate instinct for divisions that demands equal sections. This is the instinct of symmetry. In reality, however, the constellations of the zodiac are quite different in size in the sky, or rather, they have different latitudes along the ecliptic. As a result, the dwelling time of the sun within the real constellations is variable, from just a week to about 1.5 months. And so, the dwelling time of the vernal equinox, which is measured over centuries and millennia, is also strongly varying. Astrologers ignore this, for the reason already mentioned. For them, the real background of the stars does not matter. Again, they stubbornly calculate only based on their 30-degree celestial sectors. Some astrologers argue that the boundaries between the constellations are not known anyway. However, astronomers disagree vigorously here. Almost 100 years ago, the International Astronomical Union defined the exact boundaries of all 88 constellations of the northern and southern hemispheres, including the 12 constellations of the zodiac. But of course, this is of little interest to astrologers. This is what the schematic zodiac would look like if the actual latitudes of the constellations along the ecliptic would be used, according to the real extensions of these constellations along the ecliptic, instead of the symmetrical 30-degree division used by astrology. whereby only those areas are actually considered in which the ecliptic intersects the respective constellation within the boundaries defined by the International Astronomical Union. We can see that the vernal equinox, whose position has not changed in the diagram, is still located in Pisces. Because the constellation Pisces takes up about 37 degrees of the ecliptic, while Aries fills only about 22 degrees. So, Pisces is quite a whole bit broader than the 30-degree sector of the astrological zodiac. This is also true for Aquarius and many other constellations, while others are significantly smaller than 30 degrees. So, in the abstract zodiac of astrologers, which is far from reality, because all the signs have the same size, the vernal equinox has already reached Aquarius, while in the real sky, at the beginning of spring, the sun will still remain in the constellation of Pisces for about 200 more years. By the way, the smallest along the ecliptic is Scorpio. Although the constellation is actually quite large, the ecliptic crosses Scorpio at its narrowest point, in the area of the northern Caesar of the Scorpion. The sun remains within the boundaries of this constellation for just 1 week, and not 30 days, as in the astrological zodiac. The widest constellation of the zodiac is Virgo. For a month and a half, the sun dwells within the borders of the Virgin. So much for the differences between astronomy and astrology and the age of Aquarius. But let's move much further back in time, to the age of Cancer, around 8600 BC, the age of Leo, to 10,500 BC, and the age of Virgo, which went back to 13,000 BC, when the last glacial period ended, and the Neolithic began. In each of these epochs, at the beginning of spring, the sun stood in the respective constellation. This astronomical event, the switch of the beginning of spring from one constellation to the following, seemed to play an important role in cultural history. Some authors connect the bull worship in Babylon, Egypt, and Crete to the age of Taurus, or the Christian Easter lamb to the age of Aries. Perhaps the oldest civilizations already saw the vernal equinox moving from one constellation to another and considered it a world-changing event. This presupposes that they followed the course of the sun through the zodiac exactly, and that therefore an astronomical science existed. It began with the discovery and naming of the 12 zodiacal constellations and the zodiac itself. And probably these were invented by the ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia. When all of this is true, the birth of astronomy and astrology could be determined to some extent. 3 constellations, which in ancient times were often connected with water, followed most conspicuously one after the other: Pisces, Aquarius, and Capricorn. If you are now wondering what Capricorn has to do with water, originally, this constellation represented the sea goat, half a fish and half a goat. However, it is not entirely certain to what extent the Sumerians really saw a fish in Pisces. Moreover, in ancient Babylon, the constellation of Pisces was mythologically associated with the goddess of love and fertility, Ishtar, and one part was even called the Great Swallow, a bird, which certainly had nothing to do with water. Nevertheless, it is quite possible that this quarter of the zodiac corresponded to the 3-month rainy season in Sumerian and Babylonian times. During the 3 rainy months of December, January, and February, the sun moved through the zodiacal constellations of Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. It doesn't do that today anymore. We have to go back to about 3000 BC, respectively, to the age of Taurus, for the Sumerian and Babylonian rainy season to coincide with the 3 constellations, Pisces, Aquarius, and Capricorn. That is, 5,000 years ago. This assumption is consistent with the fact that some early zodiac representations bear the indication the beginning of spring is made by the bull, and that Taurus was also called the Golden Gate of the zodiac. And it coincides with evidence that 5,000 years ago, Egyptians and Maya were already observing the stars. But astronomy is perhaps even much older. In the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, the zodiac, which the Egyptians took over from the Babylonians, was embedded in the ceiling. However, it is not Taurus that starts the zodiac there, but Leo. Now the temple is by no means very old. It dates from the late Greek period around 50 BC, the late time of the Ptolemies. Nevertheless, some authors see in this an indication for an ancient tradition in Egypt, according to which the zodiac should begin with Leo. This could mean that its invention reaches up into the age of Leo. As mentioned before, this was approximately 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. This is one reason why some authors date the Egyptian high culture much older than common historical research does today. According to them, for example, the Great Sphinx of Giza is supposed to be at least 10,000 years old, and to have been modeled after a lion only because at that time, the vernal equinox was in the constellation of Leo. However, these assumptions are highly controversial. It is more probable that the beginning of astronomy goes back at least to the age of Gemini, that is 6500 to 4300 BC. At that time, the peak of the sun's orbit, the summer solstice, was in the constellation of Virgo. However, for Egyptians and Babylonians she was not a virgin, but the Queen of Heaven, the Great Mother. She held an ear of wheat in her hand, a symbol of fertility. The Queen of Heaven had an unconditional claim to the place of honor in the zodiac, where the sun reached its highest position. It is hard to imagine that she would have been placed next to it by one constellation, as it would have been the case in the age of Taurus. If we accept this admittedly quite speculative theory, we reach back to the age of Gemini with the beginning of a scientific astronomy, until about 5000 BC. If this is true, astronomy would be 7,000 years old. There is a clear reason why mankind has been doing celestial research for so long. No less than space and time depend on it. Today, it is difficult for us to imagine what it was like to live on an unknown Earth, without maps, without any other concept than the endless going on. There were only directional points, signposts in the nearest surroundings. The world seemed to be limited by the horizon, but the horizon always wandered along, every place had a different one. The last frontier explored by travelers was the ocean, also blurring into the endless. Looking up at the starry night sky was the only real support. It kept spinning, but its lights always returned along certain paths. The sun, moon, and stars were the only beacons for orientation on Earth. Orientation means facing east, to where the sun rises. The eastern and western directions were the first and most easily recognizable cardinal points, the rising and setting of the celestial bodies. The term north goes back to another discovery, for which it was necessary to look more closely to the night sky. Namely, that not all stars rise and set, but some rotate in circles in a certain area of the sky. This was done especially by 7 bright stars, which were arranged in a special way. Like 7 threshing oxen on the threshing floor, they moved around every night. Therefore, the Romans called them septemtriones, the 7 oxen. The ancient Greeks used to see a she-bear in that asterism. Later people saw a Big Dipper, whose ride pointed them easily and safely to the pole of the celestial rotation, to the north. This nocturnal guide was particularly revered by the Chinese. They attached great importance to the 4 cardinal points. The Chinese gave them a center, China itself, the Middle Kingdom, around which a squared earth was formed. This worldview became the scheme for all the basic concepts of the Chinese philosophy. They related the constellations and the planets to the 4 cardinal points, the seasons and the daytimes, the elements, the basic properties of all things, the main orders of the animals and plants, the main viscera of the human being, the main processes of the human soul, and finally still the main epochs of the Chinese history. Only the sun and the moon, the male and female principle, yang and yin, were given a special position. Thus, a philosophy on astronomical basis arose. Orientation by cardinal points was a government problem of the highest order. For every city the exact position of the celestial pole had to be determined, every temple, every building, and every tomb had to be aligned exactly to the north, the emperor's throne, the house owner's seat, and the door had to point strictly to the south. Therefore, astronomers were held in very high esteem. They were the scholars in general, at the same time the teachers. They gave the right places and the right time for all activities, wars, festivals, hunting, sowing, and harvesting, even for bathing and sweeping the house. In short, they organized the whole life of their people. When public buildings were to be built, the emperor himself determined the north-south direction in a cumberstone ceremony. As the Son of Heaven, he offered the annual sacrifice to heaven at the time of the winter solstice in the geometrically designed temple complex on the Round Hill, near Beijing, the most important religious act in ancient China. Thus, from the human need for orientation, once a pure religion of the heaven developed. The precondition for this would also have been fulfilled in Egypt. Here, the art of orientation was at least as highly developed as in China. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built by Pharaoh Khufu, deviates only slightly from the cardinal points. Its baseline, which is 230 meters long, does not stand out from the horizontal by more than a few centimeters at any point. Some pharaohs called themselves the sons of the sun. Like the Son of Heaven in China, they aligned the temple buildings, even carried out the astronomical measurements with their own hands. But the Egyptians were far too attached to their ancestral gods to have founded a pure celestial religion. It took a long time until the priests succeeded in enforcing the doctrine that all local deities were only another manifestation of the sun god Ra. When Pharaoh Akhenaten tried to impose an abstract sun cult on the people, he failed. The Egyptians were much more bound to their traditions than the Chinese. For Egyptians, time was not a constant. It was relative, so to speak. Not theoretically, as with Einstein, but tangibly in daily life. Every hour had a different length. The hours at noon were longer than in the evening and in the morning. And also, in each place the time ran differently. That is unimaginable for us today. For us, time is a steady flow. We consider this concept of time to be the only conceivable one. It's hard to imagine that there were ever people who felt otherwise. In fact, however, all earlier cultures had a different concept of time than we have today. There is no innate or inherent time consciousness anyway. The change of day and night creates a rhythm of life, but none of us really thinks about it. It is probably only the seasons, with their various demands on life, that have created the idea of recurring sequences. The need to count days, that is, to measure periods of time, already presupposed highly developed social living. And there was already an astronomical science when people began to divide the daily routine and thus create a consciously perceivable time. The first time marker was noon, the moment of the shortest sun shadow. One of the oldest scientific instruments, the gnomon, the shadow stick, was invented in order to find it precisely. From there, probably a long process led to the sundial. With it, the concept of time came into being. It was not invented, but literally created with the hands. Only the moving on of the sun shadow on the divided underground changed an unconscious feeling into a more and more comprehensible concept. And now the main thing. For the inventors of the sundial, the Egyptians, time did not pass evenly, but sometimes slower, and sometimes faster. For a reason that could be considered a coincidence. They divided the board of the sundial into equal sections. The instinct for symmetry seems to have kicked in again here. But the sun passes over the sky in an arc, therefore its shadow passed through the lines on the board in different periods of time. The 6 hours of the Egyptian day had different lengths. Moreover, they got different length again, depending on the season. The winter hours became 1/7 shorter than the summer hours. How ingrained this idea was to the Egyptians is shown by an unbelievable fact. They even set their water clocks to changing hour lengths. At the running water they had the continuous time flow directly before eyes. But no, with an unbelievable effort of skill and intellect they made a highly complicated device out of a simple one, and an artificial irregularity out of a regular natural function, only to achieve the only correct time flow in their opinion, namely, the irregular time flow of their sundials. Until that succeeded, centuries must have passed. This is evident from the epitaph of Amenemhet, seal keeper of the 18th dynasty around 1500 BC, during the reign of Amenhotep I. In this, it is emphasized that Amenemhet had built the perfect water clock that worked correctly. It was not even necessary to have several water flows to indicate the changing lengths of the hours. With a single outflow it was even able to change the hours according to the seasons. The Egyptian time measurement with the relative time concept remained exemplary for the whole antiquity. Athens, for example, was very proud of its Tower of the Winds, which, apart from a weather vane, carried no less than 8 sundials, visible from all directions and even from great distance. They supposedly measured the time to within 3 or 4 minutes, which seems a bit strange today, considering that the number of minutes in each hour was different. But the Greeks must have felt as comfortable and reassured in their fluctuating time conditions as we do at the sight of our blinking displays. In contrast, other ancient cultures coped with 2 contradictory concepts of time without getting out of joint. The Babylonians and Chinese did not align their water clocks with the sundials but let them run evenly. So, they had 2 kinds of hours, alternating hours, and hours of the same length, which apparently did not confuse them at all. The calendar has nothing to do with the fluctuating sense of time. It is dictated with absolute authority by the sun and the moon. To find out the course of the 2 celestial bodies exactly enough, in order to fix year and month afterwards, was perhaps the longest effort which was ever made in the antique astronomy. It was necessary. Public life, festivals, dates, lists of rulers, everything subject to the annual cycle depended on it. So did survival, because if you missed the time for sowing, you couldn't reap a harvest. Even in the Bible, in the story of creation, it is said what the stars were created for. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14.
Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for seasons and for days and years."
However, the calculation of time did not begin with the year. Much older is the month. The revolution of the moon with its changing of phases is the most remarkable movement in the sky. Its duration was much easier to determine than a revolution of the sun. The moment could be fixed quite exactly, when for the first time the new moon appeared again. Already with primitive cultures this moment was celebrated. In Europe, in the 14th century many people still prayed to the new moon, although this was punishable by the church. Whoever turned over a piece of silver, it brought good luck for the whole month. The month with about 30 days gave a measure for the seasons, and for the year. The sun needed about 12 months until it returned to the same constellation, so the year had 360 days. This number was not observed but calculated. But in Egypt, there was a more convenient annual signpost. The floods of the Nile River. They began extremely regularly, in obvious connection with the sun. Around the same time, the brightest star in the sky, Sirius, emerged from the sunshine. The heliacal rising of Sirius became the Egyptian New Year. It turned out that the true length of the year was not 360, but 365 days. It was one of the most painful realizations of mankind. It threw out the beautiful calculation with the sacred numbers 12 and 30. Heaven proved to be irrational. The Egyptians never got over the disappointment. They defiantly maintained the symmetrical 360-day year alongside the year of 365 days, dictated by the Nile and Sirius. As a result, there were two calendars, a complicated double-entry bookkeeping of time. Not for nothing the chief priest in Heliopolis was called Observer of the Secrets of Heaven, because probably he had a lot to do, keeping this confusion in order. The people had to put up with the fact that the festivals of the two-time calculation methods got mixed up and shifted anew from year to year. In addition, there was the even more embarrassing. Sirius also slipped slowly into the Nile floods because of the wandering Earth pole. The Egyptians realized that they came most exactly with a year of 365 and a quarter days. There were radical reformers who wanted to use this year length exclusively, but the Egyptian reverence for tradition forced the persistence with the double calendar. For a short period, the priests made each pharaoh swear at his coronation that he would not change the Sirius year or bring the mathematical year into line with reality by leap days. The leap day method, spurned by the Egyptians, prevailed everywhere else. It was a silver bullet, and it came from the Babylonians. These skillful organizers did it in the most convenient way. They waited a few years until the difference between the mathematical and the real year amounted to 30 days, and then added a 13th month. An unlucky month, when you better stay at home and postpone all business. The 13 has remained an unlucky number to this day. But the true year length is 365 days, 6 hours, 9 minutes, and 9.539 seconds, and the true month length is 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 2.8 seconds. These tiny fractions of time add up quite considerably over the centuries, which is why the Babylonians never arrive at an ideal leaping mode. Their final solution, in 383 BC, was 7 leap months in 19 years. This means that their astronomers already knew the true length of the year to the minute. Of course, they had not measured it directly. They arrive at this count only through innumerable periodic observations over centuries. A scientific achievement of the very highest order. The calendar problem turned out to be the main task for the early cultures, which has engaged more learned minds than any other. The achieved length of the year is a touchstone how far the different cultures have advanced in exact science. The Indians perform worse there. Before their acquaintance with the Greeks and Ptolemy, they did not even correctly determine the number of days. For astrological purposes, they calculated with completely arbitrary year lengths of 324 and 378 days. Obviously, the tendency to numerical mysticism prevailed among them. In China, they had already reached 365 and a quarter days around 2000 BC. The Greeks roughly equaled the Babylonians, then adopted the Babylonian leap mode. In the course of 3 centuries, however, it resulted in such large errors that Julius Caesar had to reform the calendar. In the Roman way, practically and simply, with a leap day every 4th year. Theoretically a step backwards. The whole Middle Ages suffered from it, until the Gregorian calendar reform in 1585, which is still valid today. Undoubtedly a very satisfying one. The yearly deviation varies only by seconds. In 36,000 years the error is less than 1 day. And yet there was a better calendar, whose year length was correct down to seconds. That of the Maya, in Central America. You learn to appreciate it only by understanding the extremely unwieldy number system of the Maya. They multiplied their basic number 20 by 1 to 13, so, for them, the unit 260 replaced our 100. The year had 18 months of 20 days, to which 5 unlucky days were added. 52 such years resulted in 73 units, comparable to our centuries, altogether a period of 18,980 days, the millennium of the Maya history. In spite of this conceivably alienating calculation system, the Maya calendar reached the highest accuracy by cleverly chosen additional leap days. Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about the astronomical activity of this culture. But they probably far surpassed all others in patience and observation skills. For they succeeded in determining the orbit of Venus to the day. An extraordinary achievement. However, Venus was also their second main deity after the sun and received human sacrifices when she became visible. She supplanted the moon god, perhaps because the moon is the most unpredictable of all the celestial bodies and fits least into the calendar. The calendar apparently grew so close to the Maya's hearts that they formed a cult with it. The ornaments of their temples were petrified time calculations. On every column, every relief, the times of the year, the month, the day were crowded. The whole public life was calendrical supervised and chronologically divided. The oldest task of the astronomers consisted in a warning service. They had to make sure that no one was surprised by the wrath of the heavens. Everyone was frightened when something unexpected happened to the stars. A colored halo around the moon, a new star with a tail, an eclipse of the sun. One did not ask where it came from. In the case of a hazard, the only thing that matters is where it is aimed. And few things can aim more clearly than a comet's tail, which may stretch halfway across the sky. People did not yet ask about the meaning of these signs. The only important thing was whether it would be possible to reconcile the gods. And therefore, the people and the rulers had to be ready in time for public repentance, prayer, and sacrifice. When an eclipse occurs, a Chinese account tells us, the emperor does not take a full meal and has the drums beaten at the national altar. All officials take off their official clothes, the princes offer pieces of silk, and the chronicler makes a speech until the eclipse is over. The Emperor Guangwu, who lived at the time of the Roman Emperor Augustus, gave an example of how a pious ruler behaves while facing the battle that the sun fights against the dragon that threatens to devour it. For 5 days he withdrew to reflect on his government. Then he issued an edict.
It is necessary to improve our mistakes and thereby prevent the misfortune that heaven sends. I want the great ones of my court to tell me their opinion unequivocally in secret letters.
His court astronomer wrote.
According to the rules of astronomy, solar eclipses should only occur on the first day of the month. This eclipse occurred on the last day. This is because the moon has accelerated its course. The sun is the emperor's image, the moon is the subject's image. But the errors of the subjects usually originate in those of the ruler.
This bold language shows how high the prestige of an astrologer was in China. But it could also be his undoing. An ancient legend tells the story of the two court astronomers, Qi and Ho. They were sitting in the pub when a solar eclipse began. Because of this, they were put on trial. The verdict was,
the prayer drums have beaten, the mandarins have risen, the people have gathered. In the meantime, Qi and Ho, like wooden figures, have seen and heard nothing. Their carelessness in calculating and observing the celestial bodies is punished by death.
They were not expected to predict the event ahead of time. It had been proved too often that this was impossible. Even the best astronomers of the ancient times, the Babylonians, have been wrong many times. Their regular observation reports to the king, immortalized on clay tablets in cuneiform writing, often contain the confession of failure.
As for the solar eclipse my king spoke of, it did not occur. On the 27th day I will look out again and report. On the 13th day and the night of the 14th day, we watched the sky. On the 15th day the sun and moon were seen together, but no eclipse took place. 7 times I got up, but no eclipse took place. I will still send the decisive report.
Amazing impeccability. It resulted from the fact that Babylonian astronomy was considered infallible by the king. Not the observatory or the astronomer was responsible for the absence of a solar eclipse, but the heavens. The sky deviated from the norm for unknown reasons, with the result that the king repented. There was no way of knowing what the heavens meant by this. In the worst case, the astronomer received a tablet with the following decree.
The king is displeased because of the long fast, and inquires if the new moon has still not appeared.
This is quite interesting and a little funny. Because science fails, the king must fast. I don't think there was any fasting at the observatory. It is easy to understand from classical examples how astrology has gradually developed in step with astronomy. Everyone could see that the stars had an influence. The sun regulated the seasons by the height of its arc, bringing drought and rainy months. When the Pleiades reappeared from the sun's rays, around the time of the new moon of spring, devastating storms occurred. This effect of the seven sisters is also described in an ancient Sumerian hymn.
Winter storms, the evil demons, on the ridge of heaven, raise their heads. They do their mischief. They think of evil, day after day. 7 in number, messengers of their king. A wrathful tempest in the sky roaring. They lay down before the shining moon.
The moon itself was also a weather maker. It is still considered as such today, although this has never been proven, as has its influence on the female menstrual cycle. The Babylonians believed they had discovered many other connections. They predicted a long reign for a new king if the first month was longer than calculated, or if 2 stars set together when the moon stood at its highest. A halo at moonrise predicted a crown prince. If a new moon occurred exactly at the beginning of a 30-day month, this signified good fortune for the whole kingdom. They also expected similar effects from the planets. The Babylonians must have been very surprised when they discovered that some of the stars were also moving in the same orbit as the moon and the sun, namely in the zodiac. 2 of them, the morning star and the evening star, even turned out to be the same planet, which was sometimes east and sometimes west of the sun. The striking change of position must mean something. It was solemnly appointed by the Babylonians as the 3rd main star and frequently depicted, with 8 rays, next to the crescent moon and the sun disk. Venus was identical with the Babylonian fertility goddess Ishtar. Already around 2000 BC, a cuneiform tablet explained.
When Ishtar becomes visible in the east on the 6th day, there is rain and destruction. Until the 10th day she remains east, on the 11th day she disappears and remains invisible for 3 months. Then if she shines again in the west in 3 months, there are enmities in the land, but the crops will flourish.
It can be seen how astrology and astronomy were intertwined and push each other forward. Without the belief in planetary effects on humans and nature, ancient astronomy might not have progressed beyond the observations required by the calendar. But at Venus, the Babylonians were to experience a surprise. With usual honesty, they immortalize it on burnt clay.
When Ishtar enters Scorpio, as is well known, a flood will occur. It will not occur this time, because, as soon as Ishtar approached Scorpio's chest, she was swept away. Although she touched the scorpion, yet she did not penetrate.
This was the first acquaintance with the great mystery of ancient celestial science, the occasional retrograde motion of the planets. The celestial religions in China and Babylon were completely different. In China, the stars became gods. In Babylon, the gods became stars. The Chinese considered the mysteries of the cosmos to be of such sublime value that they degraded their old popular gods to demons and created a star cult without priests, without myths, and without dogmas. The Babylonians, on the other hand, moved their ancestral deities one by one to the heavens and simply transferred their mythical properties to the planets. A process that cannot be marveled at enough. Because for the first and only time a religion made the divine beings visible and calculable by identifying them with the planets. The impulse for this is already expressed in the cuneiform writing. Since the ancient Sumerian character for god or deity was a star symbol. According to a Babylonian legend, Bel, the lord of earth, commanded the three gods, Shamash, Sin, and Ishtar, to guard the reach of heaven. Since then, they have been making their courses as the sun, the moon, and Venus. When 4 more wandering stars were found on the reach of heaven, the Babylonian priests repeated the deed of Bel. The imperial god, Marduk, became the planet Jupiter, the god of death, Nergal, became the planet Mars, the god of war, Ninib, became Saturn, and the god of knowledge, Nabu, became Mercury. From this developed a form of worship that was synonymous with astronomy. By observing the planets and studying their movements and relationships to each other, the priest performed the highest rite of his religion. Planetary observation was even more, namely research of the divine will. Mars was called the star of judgment on the dead. The Etemenanki, a probably 70 or 90 meters high ziggurat in Babylon, was observatory and Marduk temple at the same time. It was called House of the Foundations of Heaven and Earth. Thus, the Babylonians could really and truly look into the eyes of their gods. It is commonly said that many of the scientific knowledge and achievements of antiquity were lost in the Dark Middle Ages. That it is not quite the case, we owe primarily to Islam. Judaism was forbidden to deal with astronomy, and the Jewish lunisolar calendar, to which our Easter and Pentecost are still attached today, was one of the most inaccurate. The young Islam took over this calendar, however, soon its inadequacy turned out. If it had gone after the first Islamic leaders, the Muslims would have done as little celestial science as the Jews. But things turned out differently. The Quran required Muslims to bow in the direction of the Kaaba, to Mecca, when praying, whether they were at home or on a journey. This was not an easy requirement to fulfill in Spain, Africa, and India. One had to know the longitude and latitude of the current location. Since it can only be read from the celestial bodies, astronomy developed with the specific aim of determining location. For this purpose, observatories were established everywhere, in Baghdad, Cairo, and Samarkand. There, observations were made with newly invented instruments, wall circles, quadrants, and astrolabes. These were copied centuries later, and some are still preserved. However, little more came out than occasional corrections to the data of Ptolemy. The worldview of the Greek astronomy was not changed by the purely practical Arabic astronomy. Their most beautiful water clocks became treasures from 1001 Nights. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid made such a clock a gift to Emperor Charlemagne. Every hour brass balls fell into a cup, and at the same time 12 armored horsemen jumped out of 12 doors. A rotating disc showed the movement of the planets through the zodiac, accurate to degrees and days. One could even see when Mercury passed over the sun as a small dark spot. The marks for the wandering stars, however, had to be adjusted by hand according to the planetary tables. Only an expert could operate this marvel. The young Christianity was closer to the stars than Judaism. When Emperor Constantine considered Christianity to be legitimate, Jesus' birthday was moved to December 25th, the winter solstice. Fittingly, this had already been a Roman feast day. Astrology, on the other hand, was initially frowned upon in the Christian West. It was considered idolatry. Nevertheless, astrology came into fashion in the Middle Ages. We can even date the time almost to the year when this happened. In 1108, the Archbishop of York was refused a Christian burial because a book on astrology had been found under his pillow. In 1109, the English scholar, Adelhard of Bath, named astrology the knowledge of the past, the present and the future. Since then, there has been no significant rejection of astrology. The entire medicine was practiced according to the stars. For bloodletting, there were complicated rules, which assigned each part of the body to a sign of the zodiac and thus to daytimes and hours. Medicinal herbs could be picked and administered only on certain nights. Even the analysis of urine depended on the position of the planets. There were hours for government treaties, groundbreaking ceremonies, battles, and receptions, for traveling, playing chess and changing clothes. The astrologer moved out with the troops, advised the commander who gave the signal to mount and march. The Habsburg Emperor Maximilian suffered all his life from the pressure of being a child of Saturn, and the German painter Albrecht Dürer comforted him with his copperplate engraving Melancholia, in which every little detail was an allusion to astrological secrets. Even the popes eventually capitulated to astrology. Leo X established a chair of astrology at the University of Rome. Julius II had his coronation day, and Paul IV had each consistory determined by an astrologer. It is amazing how the Church, usually so concerned with pure doctrine, has been overwhelmed by the ancient magic of the long-vanished celestial religion of the Babylonians. Thus, the Middle Ages gradually learned to fear heaven. For something uncanny was going on up there. Fiery stars moved across the sky, some came off, fell to the ground, and burned up. Quite often the chroniclers gave free play to their fantasy in their descriptions of such events.
In the year of the Lord 1543, one saw a frightening comet in the shape of a dragon. A star, larger than a millstone, appeared and turned its tail toward noon. From here, fire fell on the earth like a cruel dragon, which drank from a little brook, and dried it up completely. Afterwards it jumped on a field, and ate down everything from it. Then it swung again in the height and left a great dying.
There were 7 kinds of comets, each having a different terrible meaning. When no misfortune wanted to follow the comet of 1402, the people were even more frightened than usual, until in a village near Rome, a calf was born with 2 heads. The whole Christianity trembled because of planetary conjunctions. A 7-fold conjunction in 1186 prophesied a global cataclysm of unprecedented scale. Underground bunkers were built in all countries. The Emperor of Byzantium had the windows of his palace removed and had them covered with wooden beams instead. The Archbishop of Canterbury ordered a 3-day fast. When not a single breath of air stirred on that day, the city's monk chronicler mocked.
We only saw the storm which His Eminence let loose from the pulpit.
After that, it became quiet for some time about such prophecies. But then the disaster warnings repeated every few decades. The greatest panic arose in 1524, when Stoffler's calendar indicated a whole series of highly alarming planetary conjunctions, the most threatening for February 2nd. Spanish astrologers confirmed the prediction. A flood of leaflets alarmed Europe. People preached, read, and spoke of nothing but the coming flood. The emperor was asked to let officials everywhere determine where people should flee. The inhabitants of Toulouse built and supplied a huge boat ark. In the coast cities, the population was distributed on ships. Mass hysteria broke out and some really lost their minds. On the day of the catastrophe, the Margrave of Brandenburg and the families of the court squatted on the ridiculous Kreuzberg in Berlin, surrounded by howling and wailing subjects. Not a single drop fell from the sky. The curious fact is that at that time, after a few decades, the world was convinced that it had actually experienced this terrible flood disaster and had only just survived. This shows how little experience counteracts wishful thinking. Martin Luther's friend Melanchthon explicitly pointed out in his lectures on astrology that the prophecy of 1524 had been fulfilled during his lifetime. From this, everyone could recognize the power of the stars. But fortunately, the Middle Ages obtained their scientific education not from clerics and charlatans, but from no other than the Muslims. In the early Middle Ages, the Church had banned astrology as well as astronomy. It was considered idolatry to study the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, as these pagan idols might regain power. This went so far as to omit the simplest observations for calendar purposes. The Pope once had to send an envoy to Spain, which was under Islamic rule at that time, to find out from the Muslims when Easter and Pentecost took place that year. Long before the Crusades, the kings of the Occident acquired Arab weapons, jewelry, and equipment from Muslim traders. Their greatest treasures were admired only as showpieces. Their real value was not appreciated at all, because mostly not understood. This was also the case with the astronomical water clock that Harun al-Rashid sent to Emperor Charlemagne. It was marveled at with open mouths by the Frankish knights, but not even the court scholar, Einhard, knew what to do with it. Einhard wrote charters and decrees, established schools, wrote the king's biography, and taught him the little astronomy he himself knew. In his almanacs, he recorded solar and lunar eclipses, and once, in the year 807, he gave amazingly accurate dates that were never repeated. This was, of course, the very year that the Arabian clock arrived. Apparently, the Arab official in charge of the delegation gave a demonstration of how the water clock worked and how it was to be maintained. The unique accuracy of Einhard's data in that year came from this man and his lessons. But as soon as the Arab delegation had left, it turned out that Karl's minister had not really kept track of everything that he had been taught. The wonder clock was displayed in the chapel of Aachen Castle and never set in motion again. Almost 4 centuries passed before European scholars were willing to learn from the Muslims. Around 1250, the Hohenstaufen Emperor Frederick II surrounded himself with Arab scholars in Salerno. In Castile, King Alfonso X did the same, also paying a commission of 50 foreign astronomers for 10 years to calculate planetary tables. It was not until around 1450 that astronomers from Florence and Rome began to observe independently, impartially, and objectively. Their instruments came from Johann Müller from Königsberg, who called himself, Regiomontanus, the first real scholar according to our understanding. He applied Arabian trigonometry to the curved firmament, proved to the Pope that the ecclesiastical calculation of Easter must fail 30 times in the next 50 years, and called for a fundamental reform of the Julian calendar. He and others prepared the way for all future discoveries and achievements in astronomy, such as those of Nicolaus Copernicus, who once again overturned the world view, or Johannes Kepler, who found the laws of planetary motion. And finally, the telescope arrived, which Galileo Galilei used to literally break the boundaries of the universe overnight and usher in a new age of research. So, 7,000 years lie behind us, during which we have learned to look a little, not much, behind the secrets of the cosmos. But even today, in the age of the James Webb Space Telescope and interplanetary space probes, nothing has changed about the fact that we are still asking questions and looking for answers. Because, as Isaac Newton once put it.
What we know is a drop. What we don't know is an ocean.
Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. We also appreciate your comments. Goodbye and always stay curious and eager to learn.